By the way, thank you, Haley and Kyle, for all you do with the youth, and thank you, Jonathan and Tanya, for leading us in worship. You guys are... Technically, we hired Jonathan, but they're very much a team, and so we get like a 2-for-1 deal. And plus, yeah, well, we knew that. So, and they add so much to our church body already. So, we're continuing with our series on epic Old Testament heroes of the faith, and today I want to talk about faith, epic faith, because all of life is a story. And no story is written in isolation. Our stories are interwoven with other stories, and our story is part of God's story. And because our stories are part of God's story, then one of the major themes that God likes to weave in and through our stories is this element of faith. Now, just to define our terms, the Greek word for faith is translated two different ways in the Bible, depending on the context. Now, sometimes faith can mean just simple belief. And one of my favorite definitions for faith is believing the evidence. There's plenty of evidence for faith. God doesn't ask us to check our brains at the door when we come to faith. But I think a more comprehensive definition, but see, simple belief is not enough, really. It doesn't capture the big picture what faith is all about. Sometimes it means that, but other times a better translation is trust. And that captures the bigger picture. And so to illustrate that, I'd like to play a clip, and this is
jump this.
Indy, you must hurry. Come quickly.
It's a leap of faith.
You must believe, boy. You must believe.
that? Not likely. And even then, even once he can see the bridge, it's still like he's still way up there, and that bridge is really, small. Important safety tip: don't look down. And even the name of that scene is called Leap of Faith. And so the question is, I didn't say faith was easy. It's pretty challenging. But the question is, why is faith so important? Well, here's the deal. Faith is not only what God uses to save us, faith is what God uses to bless us. Faith is basically our ticket to get into heaven. Actually, it's through Jesus, but our faith is in Jesus. But, faith is what gets us into heaven, but it's also what God wants us to use here on earth when we're living. Now, did you ever wonder why God, once you get saved, he just doesn't take you to heaven the moment he saves you? Spares you from all the frustrations and limitations and heartaches of this world? It's because he has a purpose for your life here and now. And that purpose has to do with developing you into a person of faith. It ultimately has to do with you being involved with his story. And so why is it important that we live by faith? And there's a message outline for you to fill in the blanks and take some notes. It's even on the back side this week because I got a little carried away. But So number one is this: God is pleased when we live by faith. God's pleased when we live by faith. Hebrews 11 verse 6 says, without faith, it is impossible to please God. You might want to underline that word, impossible. It's unlikely to please God, or it's more difficult. It is impossible to please God without faith. So I want to ask you a question. What do you think is more important, to please God or to trust God? I would suggest that pleasing God, while it's an honorable motive, that easily leads into legalism. Us trying to do our best to please God. But if we trust God, the pleasing part takes care of itself. It's not that obedience is not important, but it's not the most important thing. Trusting God is what is more important than even obedience. Obedience is a reflection of our trust in God. See, we don't. So anyway, that's just my 2 bits worth. So, secondly, God is honored when we live by faith. Why? Because faith puts us in a position where we're totally dependent on God. And when he comes through, guess who gets the glory? Hebrews 11 verse 6. No, excuse me. And by the way, one of my favorite definitions of sin is to live independently from God. That was really what Adam and Eve were doing originally in the Garden of Eden when they chose and took a bite out of that fruit. And so if all we do for God we can do without God, then we don't really need faith. And whatever success we have, we get the glory. But see, that's living independently from God. So, number 3, God is impressed when we live by faith. He's impressed. Now, it's interesting that in the 4 Gospels, we don't find Jesus being impressed with anybody's righteousness or their knowledge, their good looks, or the latest sandals. You never hear Jesus saying to Peter, dude, where'd you get that robe? You are styling, my Jewish brother. Matthew, you got your bling going on. So, one day a group of people came to Jesus on behalf of a centurion who had a servant who was sick and about ready to die. And the centurion didn't go himself because he didn't feel worthy to be in Jesus' presence. But he had heard of Jesus and believed that he could heal his servant. So he sends a delegation of people saying, Jesus, say the word, and my servant will be healed. And this is what Jesus says in Luke 7, verse 9. When Jesus heard that, he was amazed at him. And turning to the crowd following, he said, I tell you, I have not found such great faith even in Israel. See, it was faith that impressed Jesus. It was faith that amazed Jesus. Now, contrast this with a time when Jesus went back to his own hometown of Nazareth, where Mark 6, verse 5 says, he could not do any miracles there except lay his hands on a few sick people and heal them. And he was amazed at their lack of faith. See, faith is the thing that impresses God. It impresses God because it's what most clearly expresses dependence on God. And then number 4, God is moved to bless us when we live by faith. When you take steps of faith, it triggers the heart of God to release his blessings in your life. Hebrews 11:6, we read the first part of this already, but without faith it is impossible to please God because anyone who comes to him must believe that he exists and that he rewards those who earnestly seek him. So if you want to have God start moving in your life, start living by faith. And I think this principle is illustrated, from the words of God himself. In the last book of the Old Testament is Malachi. The first time I read that, I thought it was an Italian prophet named Malachi, but it's Malachi. And Malachi 3:10 says, bring all the tithes into the storehouse so that there will be enough food in my temple. If you do, says the Lord, I will open the windows of heaven for you. I will pour out a blessing so great you won't have enough room to take it in. Try it. Let me prove it to you. Now, normally, an important safety tip is don't test God, but here's an occasion where he says, test me in this. He's inviting us to test him in this, to learn to be people of generosity, and that takes a leap of faith to do that. Number 5, God is experienced at a whole new level when we live by faith. And sometimes I think, we get the impression that being a follower of Christ is boring and it's mundane and, it's not the most exciting thing in the world. But I can tell you, from experience, nothing could be further from the truth unless you're not living by faith. Because if a person lives by faith, we really need to learn to depend on God, and that will take you to the edge. You can find yourself often in places where you're thinking, praying, God, you've got to come through or I'm in deep weeds here. And see, your story, your life can be a grand adventure, kind of like a four-wheel, off-road, breathtaking, white-knuckle adventure in the backcountry, over hills, around curves, through rushing water. Or, without faith, it could be like on a park bench throwing breadcrumbs to smelly pigeons. It's like, it depends on how much you want to live by faith. But I guarantee you, if you choose to live by faith, it's going to be more like a four-wheel excursion in the backcountry than sitting on a park bench. Check it out. Gideon went against 200,000 men with 300. Daniel was thrown into a lion's den. Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego were tossed into a fiery furnace. Paul was shipwrecked on a deserted island in the Mediterranean Sea. Peter walked on water. Now, all of them experienced God in new dimensions because they were willing to do what a lot of people are not willing to do. They lived in the realm of faith. So God wants us to be people who have not just been saved by faith, but who actually live by faith. So how do we become people of faith? Well, it doesn't just happen by accident or osmosis. We don't wake up one day and all of a sudden we're a person of great faith. God will often take us through some tests to develop our faith. And so this is where the story of Abraham comes in. His is a story of how God may choose to test us in order to develop our faith. And you may be going through one of these tests right now. So Abram lived a long time ago in the land of Canaan, and one day the Lord came to Abram and said, Abram, get out of your country, out of your father's house, and go to the land I will show you. And the Lord promised him, I'll make you a great nation. I'll bless you and make your name great, and you will be a blessing. And so Abram, to his credit, packed up all of his belongings, took Sarai, his wife, Lot, his brother's son, all of his servants, and all of his cattle, and left for a new land. And any time in the Bible we see Abram, he obeys God. God asks him to do something, and his obedience is always immediate. And God says, I'm sending you to a new home without a map. And Abram packs up his family and does it. And Abram and his family traveled a long way, passing through towns and villages. And when they reached the plain of Moreh, the Lord appeared to Abram again and said, I will give this land to your children. And Abram said, God, you'll give me what? To children? I'm childless. Have you forgotten that, Lord? And so the Lord said, look now toward heaven and see the stars. And if you are able to number them, so your seed shall be. Now, Abram really didn't know what the Lord meant, again, because he had no children of his own, but he trusted the Lord and praised him that day. Abram believed God, and God counted it to him as righteousness. Now, Sarai, Abram's wife, didn't have any children, so she suggested Hagar, the maid, be Abram's wife and give him a child. But guess what? That didn't turn out so as well as she had planned. Because as soon as Hagar became a wife, she did not respect Sarai anymore. And so Sarai got upset with Hagar because Hagar was disobeying her, wouldn't do the things she'd asked her to do. And so Hagar ran away into the desert. And the angel of the Lord found Hagar next to a fountain of water, and the angel said, Hagar, Sarai's maid, what are you doing? Where are you going? She said, I ran away from Sarai. Well, return to Sarai and obey her. You will have a son, and his name will be Ishmael. And just as the angel had said, Hagar had a son when Abram was 86 years old. And Abram called his son Ishmael. Years passed quickly, and before long, Abram was 99 years old. So fast forward 13 years. The Lord appeared to Abram again like many times before, and the Lord said, I am Almighty God. I have promised that you will be the father of many nations. From now on, you'll be called Abraham instead of Abram, and your wife Sarai will be called Sarah, and I will bless her with a son. Now, Abram, his first response was to laugh. You're going to give us a child? Correct me if I'm wrong, but that's physically impossible. I'm 100 years old. My wife Sarah is 90 years old. How can this be? And the Lord continued, Sarah, your wife, will have a son. You'll call him Isaac. I will make an agreement with him, and I will bless him with a lot of land. As for your other son, Ishmael, I will bless him too, and from him will come 12 great princes, but my agreement will be with Isaac. And so Abram was sitting at the door of his tent a few days later, and it was in the middle of the day. The sun was very hot. He looked up and noticed that 3 men were standing next to him, and he knew that they were messengers of the Lord. So Abram said, hello, come on in. Can I get you some bread and food? And they asked him, well, where's Sarah, your wife? He said, well, she's in our tent. The Lord said, Sarah will have a son. And Sarah heard what they said, and she started to laugh because she knew that they were both way too old for that. But the Lord asked Abram, why did Sarah laugh? Is anything too difficult for the Lord? At the time appointed, I will return, and Sarah will have a son. And later the Lord visited Sarah, as he said he would, and Sarah had a son. They named their son Isaac. And so, as you all know, Sarah and Abraham were both very old, and so that was a real miracle. And Sarah said, God made me laugh so that everyone who heard would laugh with me. Who would have thought that I would have given Abraham a son? Again, one of the more amazing miracles in the Bible, if you think about it. But if God promises something, he's going to come through. So Hebrews chapter 11 is called the Hall of Fame of Faith. Check out Hebrews 11, verse 8. By faith, Abraham, when called to go to a place he would later receive as his inheritance, obeyed and went, even though he didn't know where he was going. By faith, he made his home in the promised land like a stranger in a foreign country. Then verse 11. By faith, Abraham, even though he was past age and Sarah herself was barren, was enabled to become a father because he considered him faithful who had made the promise. And then verse 17. By faith, Abraham, when God tested him, offered Isaac as a sacrifice. Abraham reasoned that God could raise the dead, and figuratively speaking, he did receive Isaac back from death. And so Abraham really is an amazing example of faith, because every time you see him, again, his response and his obedience is instant. And that's why he's recognized as the father of 3 world religions, Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. Islam claims Abraham as one of the founders of their faith. And again, don't denigrate Ishmael, because he was a child of promise as well. It wasn't the original covenant with Isaac, but he was still a child of promise. So, I want to talk about 4 tests that Abraham went through that we can resonate with when it comes to developing our faith. And the first one is the test of a major life change. Now, this major life change could be a new job opportunity, a step up and step out in a new adventure. It could be a change of health, change of family situation. But for Abraham, it was a major relocation project. One day, God came to Abraham and asked him to pack up everything he owned and to move. And if that wasn't hard enough, God didn't tell him where he was going to. You're going to move without a map. I'm kind of a map guy. That would drive me crazy. So Genesis 12, verse 1. The Lord had said to Abram, leave your country, your people, and your father's household, and go to the land I will show you. Now, that is not an easy task. Abraham is 75 years old by this point. He's thinking, I'm ready to retire. And God says, no, you're ready to aspire. I'm ready for Social Security. No, you're ready for some insecurity. I'm ready to take it easy. And God says, no, get ready for the biggest adventure of your life. And so Abraham opened a new business that today has become known as U-Haul. So faith question number 1. Will I follow God's leading without knowing where? Will I follow God's leading without knowing where? Man, I'd like to know the plan. I'd like to know the destination. That would be challenging. And God said to Abraham, you're on a need-to-know basis. I'll tell you when you get there. Now, perhaps some of you are facing a major life change. You're not sure where you're supposed to go, and you might be asking where. That's a good question. And maybe God is saying, get moving, start taking some steps, and I will direct you. See, faith is visualizing the future while you're living in the present. It is literally seeing in advance. I must believe what I don't see. People say, well, I'll believe it when I see it. Well, that's not faith. I'll believe that my spouse will change when I see it. I believe that my son or daughter will grow up when I see it. Again, that's not faith. Faith is believing even when you don't see it. Hebrews 11:1 says, now faith is being sure of what we hope for and certain of what we do not see. See, God says something very different than believe what you see. Faith says, I believe it's possible in advance, long before it ever happens. Now, I wonder, what kind of a difference would it make if we started praying, Lord, by faith, I am believing you to save my marriage. Or, Lord, by faith, I'm believing you to provide for my financial needs. Lord, by faith, I'm believing you to bring my children to salvation. Well, the second test is this. It's the test of a delayed promise. God told Abraham that if you move, I'll give you the land of Israel. But he left out a minor detail in that exchange, because when Abraham got there, there's going to be a delay in the transfer of ownership. Hebrews 11:9 says this, because Abraham had faith, he lived as a stranger in the promised land. He lived there in a tent, and so did Isaac and Jacob, who were later given the same promise. See, Abraham lived a long time after that first promise when he was 75, and he never did personally receive the blessing. He lived in a tent. Now, how would you like to live in a tent for like 50 years? Talk about temporary housing. I mean, tent camping is all right for the short term, but it's less than ideal. It's not even as good as an RV. So this verse also says, and so did Isaac and Jacob, who were given the same promise. So that's 2 more generations. In other words, Abraham had to wait 3 generations before this promise began to be fulfilled. And I can imagine he probably started every conversation with God. Okay, Lord, don't you think I've waited long enough here? Wouldn't today be a great day for that promise to come through? See, and a lot of people can handle tests if they know that there's a time frame, a light at the end of the tunnel. But I think the degree of difficulty goes way up when there's no end in sight, and it doesn't appear that things are getting any better. So faith question number 2 is this. Will I wait for God's timing without knowing when? Will I wait for God's timing without knowing when? And for some of you, as your story is being written, you're in a season of waiting. When will my marriage get better? When will I find a job? When will I find the right person? You know, what are you trusting God for? And he hasn't answered yet. And you're asking God, when, Lord? When? Like I've read this in the past, but I needed this for me. So this, and perhaps you've heard this. I asked God for strength that I might achieve. I was made weak that I might learn to obey. I asked for health that I might do greater things. I was given infirmity that I might do better things. I asked for riches that I might be happy. I was given poverty that I might be wise. I asked for power that I might have the praise of men. I was given weakness that I might feel the need for God. I asked for all things that I might enjoy life. I was given life that I might enjoy all things. I got nothing I asked for, but everything I had hoped for. I, among all people, am most richly blessed. See, the reality is God is never late and seldom early. His timing is perfect, although I have to admit it's almost never mine. And you see God's timing in the life of Moses and Noah and Gideon and here with Abraham. And see, God often allows us to go through the test of waiting. Well, the third test of faith is this, the test of an impossible problem. God had promised Abraham that one day he'd be the father of a great nation, the nation of Israel. But Abraham had one little problem. He was 99 years old and had no kids. Wouldn't you begin to worry a little bit? And Sarah was no spring chicken either. Abraham took a good look at himself and said, no way, Jose. And Sarah took a good look at him and said, you got that right. So, Genesis chapter 18, God sent some visitors, some angels, to talk to Abraham and Sarah about their impossible situation. Genesis 18, verse 9. The men said to him, where is Sarah, your wife? He said, in the tent. One of them said, I'm coming back about this time next year, and when I arrive, your wife Sarah will have a son. Sarah was listening at the tent opening just behind the man. Abraham and Sarah were old by this time, very old. Sarah was far past the age for having babies. Sarah laughed within herself. An old woman like me get pregnant with this old man of a husband? God said to Abraham, why does Sarah start laughing, saying, me have a baby, an old woman like me? Is anything too hard for God? I'll be back about this time next year. Well, that's a catchy ringtone. It'll get your attention. Is anything too hard for God? I'll be back about this time next year, and Sarah will have a baby. Sarah lied. She said, I didn't laugh because she was afraid. But he said, yes, you did. You laughed. Now, you know that Sarah really didn't believe she's going to have a baby because she laughed. Because I think if she really believed it, a woman her age would have cried. But it's an impossible situation. Abraham laughed, Sarah laughed, but it was God who had the last laugh. Isaac was born, and his name literally means laughter. That's what Isaac means, is laughter. Now, some of you may be worried sick because you're in an impossible situation and you're scared to death, and maybe you're not asking where or when, but asking how. How am I going to make ends meet? How am I going to get through that child of mine? So faith question number 3 is, will I expect a miracle without knowing how? So test 1, major life change. Will I follow God's leading without knowing where? Test 2, the test of a delayed promise. Will I wait for God's timing without knowing when? And then test 3, an impossible situation. Will I expect a miracle without knowing how? And the 4th one might be the most difficult one of all, the test of a senseless tragedy. There's a lot that goes on in our world that doesn't make sense. Things happen all the time that we don't have answers for. And we know that God gives us freedom of choice, and with that often comes the consequences that we have to suffer with the consequences of somebody else's sin. And we're left scratching our heads and wondering why. Hebrews 11, verse 17. It was by faith that Abraham, when God tested him, offered his son Isaac as a sacrifice. God made the promises to Abraham, but Abraham was ready to offer his own son as a sacrifice. God had said, the descendants I promised you will be from Isaac. So God puts Abraham through this probably ultimate test that would have left anyone wondering why. And Abraham didn't know that God wouldn't let him go through with it. Isaac represents everything that God had promised to Abraham. The entire blessing was contingent upon Isaac. So now he's being asked to kill his own son, sacrifice his own son. What about all the descendants? And so, our response, my response would be one of trauma and shock. That's not fair. That doesn't make any sense. How could God make a request like that? And in verse 19 of Hebrews 11, we see Abraham's confidence in God. Abraham believed that God could raise the dead, and it really was if Abraham got Isaac back from death. See, Abraham had such great faith, he believed that God could do anything he wanted to do, whether he understood it or not, because God was God. Abraham really lived with this belief. He was willing to sacrifice Isaac. Why? Why was he willing to go through with that? Because in his mind, there was no doubt God could raise the dead if he wanted to. That blows my mind, he had that kind of faith. Because that would not have been a part of my thinking, I guarantee you that. But if God could give him a child at his age, he could raise Isaac from the dead if he wanted to. So here's faith question number 4. Will I trust God's purpose even when I don't know why? There's lots of contradictions in life, a lot of things that don't make sense and we can't figure out. And some of you might be going through this test right now. Why did I lose my job? Or why did my spouse have an affair? Why is this happening to me? There's nothing wrong with asking any of these questions of God. Where, when, how, and why. But the real tests come when you ask the questions and the answers don't come immediately. Then how do you handle those questions? God didn't give Abraham any explanation during the test, and yet Abraham still followed God.
And I think one of the reasons we have difficulty living by faith is because we have to have everything figured out, have to have an explanation for everything. But if God explained everything, there'd be no need for faith, because faith takes us beyond the realm of explanation. See, the secret to passing human tests is having the right answers. But the secret to passing God's tests is knowing God and trusting Him regardless. So which of those tests are you facing right now? Are you facing a major life change and you're asking God where? God says, get moving, I will direct you. Some of you are waiting for an answer from God and you're asking when. Some of you might be facing an impossible situation, you're asking how. Or facing a senseless tragedy and you're asking why. Trust God and say, I will follow God's leading even when I don't know where. And I'll wait for God's timing even when I don't know when. I'll expect a miracle even when I don't know how, and I'll trust God's purpose even when I don't know why. And your adventure of faith will begin, and it will be as daring or as dull as you can handle. But He can take you to the deepest jungle on earth or across the street to your neighbor. It's all a matter of faith. On June 30th, 1858, quite some time ago, Charles Blondin, arguably one of the best tightrope walkers in history, stretched tightrope across Niagara Falls. And people by the thousands came by train from Buffalo, New York and Toronto, Canada, to see him walk across that tightrope that was above the raging falls. And as he stepped on the tightrope, a hush fell over the crowd. He carried with him a 40-foot-long balance bar that weighed 39 pounds. And when he finally stepped out on the Canadian side, a huge cheer rose from the crowd. And they all began to shout in unison, Blondin, Blondin, Blondin. And then he held up his hand to get the crowd's attention. He asked the crowd, how many of you believe that I can put someone on my shoulders and walk back across? And first one person shouted, I believe. Then a second, then a third, until finally the entire crowd was shouting, we believe, we believe, we believe. And then Blondin shouted, who would like to be that someone? Well, all of a sudden the crowd got real quiet. They all said they believed, but they weren't really willing to put their lives on the line. And so he pointed out first to one person, then another, and nobody would say yes until he came to his manager, a man named Mr. McDougall. And McDougall said yes. So he got on Blondin's shoulders, and a deadly silence fell over the crowd as they stepped on the tightrope. And carefully, step by step, Blondin made his way across. But when they were about halfway through, all of a sudden, the tightrope began swaying violently back and forth. A gambler who had bet Blondin would not make it had cut the guide wire. That's what held the rope in place securely. So Blondin stopped in the middle, got McDougall off his shoulders temporarily to talk to him. Blondin looked at McDougall and said, if we're going to make it to safety on the other side, you can no longer be McDougall. You have to become a part of me. You can do nothing to try to balance yourself. You have to let me do everything. If you do anything on your own, we'll both die. McDougall then got back on Blondin's shoulders, and Blondin began to walk. And finally, the last couple of paces, he literally ran down the rope to safety on the other side. That's such a vivid picture of what it means to live by faith. Is it scary? You bet. But when we become that kind of identification with Jesus, guess what? We're okay. He doesn't promise a calm passage. He does promise a safe landing. And so that's what it means to live by faith. And I know it can be scary, but here's the question. How's it working with you in control? When I was a drug and alcohol rehab chaplain, one of the things I appreciated about working with that clientele was by the time they were in that rehab hospital, they knew that life wasn't working with them in control. In fact, they knew what most people outside that hospital don't know. The big book of Alcoholics Anonymous calls it Self Will Run Riot. With self in control, my life is out of control. But see, when we give up control to God, that's when things fall into place. And at first it's really scary, because when I gave my life to Christ, I thought, Well, on the other side of that, I'm going to find a lot of finger pointing and judgment and condemnation. What I have found is on the other side of trusting God is acceptance and joy and peace and forgiveness. And so if you've never made that decision to follow the Lord, you can do that today as we close in prayer. Will you join me? God, I thank you for your grace and your goodness. And following you has its challenges. Sometimes we can be overcome with fear even. But God, at the end of the day, when we give it to you, that's when we find our rest and our security. That's when you deliver us from our fear. So God, we just say we trust you with our lives and with our salvation. In Jesus' name, amen. If you prayed that prayer for the first time, I'd like to talk to you about that. And in the meantime, we're going to close with a closing song with Tanya and Jonathan. So let's be standing as we sing.